Yeah, sure.
And did you hear that?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So I won't take too much of your time, of course. But before I start, I'd like to say that if possible, we'd very much like to stay in touch and we won't bother you too much. Maybe give you a call once every 6 months or every 9 months or whatever. But I would like to stay in touch. That's what I wanted to say. We run three websites: Eyes on Suriname, Brazil, and Indonesia. And specifically in Indonesia, we're very active, and it seems that we're going to be successful as we, and when I say we, I mean a wealthy businessman from the Netherlands has a mining company there and
Mm,
asked us, Eyes on Indonesia, to do some research and work on the reforestation of the area. And
hmm
not only that, but he's also expanding the area
mm,
into about 1.5 million acres, which is
great.
significant, where we want to capture, store, transport carbon. So there are some of the topics. Did you see the questions I sent?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
If we may start with, and I have to read it because I don't know it by heart. Um, you, the United States authorities, forest and its forest, are major contributors to the fight against climate change. And you seem to be poised to do even more. Now, it seems to me that you're focusing on what's going on in the United States. But I was wondering when I sort of read the report if that could be extended. I mean, in other words, could the American dream become a global dream?
Yeah, yes. Um, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. And the United States is very focused on forests, not only domestic forests but also international forests. And President Biden last year signed an executive order that focused on the U.S. owned forest by the Forest Service and by the Department of the Interior, and required an inventory of old growth and mature trees, and is potentially considering a policy shift that will conserve and protect those all of those trees. Um, and that's in the context of a broader initiative that the president has to encourage what he calls climate smart agriculture and forestry, and to recruit private foresters, state foresters, and federal foresters to manage their forests in a way that is more sustainable and that will increase the carbon sequestration that is already occurring in U.S. forests. As mentioned in the Stanford piece, U.S. forests are already offsetting around 15% of the entire U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, which of course are huge, unfortunately. So the forests are playing a big role, and the U.S. believes that they can play a bigger role, and that's what's happening now. Um, and in particular, Congress last year, in a law called the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically funded some additional domestic forestry initiatives, including setting aside $1.5 billion to increase urban forests, with a recognition that forest cover can help cool cities, which is obviously incredibly important here as the world is suffering from an amazing, devastating heat wave. Um, and also, $20 billion has been identified for more conservation activities, which can include tree planting in connection with agricultural lands, agroforestry, and also other conservation contexts. So, U.S. is focusing a lot on domestic forests, but also recognizes the importance of the world's forests. And one of the challenges that we discovered in our Stanford research in terms of drawing more attention and taking more advantage of the natural climate solution that forests can provide in terms of greater sequestration. One of the hindrances of turning more to forests is the fact that the amount of carbon sequestered, the advantage of the forests that they have, has not been well documented in terms of precise measurement and monitoring of that additional carbon that is saved when a forest is preserved and a forest is better managed so that it preserves more of the carbon. And that's a big thrust here in the US to improve the measurement and monitoring of forests. And we think that'll have global implications. And in fact, there's an initiative and a nonprofit called See Trees, C as in carbon, trees.org, which has combined remote sensing through satellites with machine learning, and then based on the ground truthing. And it is looking at all forests globally, and will tell you how much carbon is being sequestered in any forest on the globe. This just came out last fall in connection with the Egyptian Conference of Parties. It's a signal of the kind of data that can be brought to bear in the future to help protect forests.
Okay, so that sounds promising for us because, in my opinion, what I read about the report so far is that it gives me the impression that the United States looks at itself as quite an isolated case, where that is not the problem. When the Krakatoa erupted in 1881, I mean, all those fumes went 7 times around the globe, you know, and so do you have an idea how much globally, how much carbon could be removed globally with these new techniques?
Yes, but let me first mention in connection with that point you just made, Anton. So I was in the White House, and my focus in the Climate Policy Office in the White House was on domestic climate change. We work closely with Secretary Kerry in the State Department, but my report at Stanford is focused mostly on domestic. I'll say one other thing about the international side, though. That same executive order that the president signed last year which focused on domestic forests, and in particular old growth and mature forests, also had an important international component. It noted that a lot of the deforestation that's occurring globally is to clear land for agricultural commodity products, many of which are being imported into the US. And the president called on the State Department to do an analysis of how the US could potentially, working with the private sector and with other countries, develop approaches that would restrict and de-incentivize the deforestation that is being done for agricultural production, commodity production. So we're looking forward to that study coming out and those recommendations coming out. That's an area where there can be global cooperation because the deforestation issue is obviously a huge problem. Here we are talking about how much forests can do more in terms of carbon sequestration. Obviously, when you're destroying a forest, you're actually emitting a huge amount of carbon dioxide. And in fact, it's one of the, if not the biggest, one of the biggest sources globally of all greenhouse gas emissions. So, and in terms of your other question, how much is possible here in terms of the forest helping to combat climate? There have been a number of studies. I mean, they're pretty, ambiguous, and you can't get precise numbers here for the exact reason I was talking about a few minutes ago, which is the data are not, we've not invested enough in the data. But there's a a well-regarded study done by Brandon Griscom of the Nature Conservancy and a number of other researchers that suggests that globally, 37% of the emissions needed by 2030 to stay below 2 degrees Celsius warming can come from nature-based solutions. And the forestry sector is by far the largest contributor to that potential amazing amount of mitigation that can occur from nature-based solutions.
Yes, I see. How long do you think this can be pursued to remove additional carbon from the atmosphere? How long could it go on? I mean, in the light of the fact that the world population is growing all the time,
yeah.
So that's a huge challenge, I think. Could you comment on that?
It is a huge challenge. Obviously there's a lot of demand for land, and it really is a situation that calls for a lot of sectors working together. The agricultural sector, for example, has made great strides in producing more food on fewer acres, and also integrating trees into agricultural lands. That's a big thrust of this. The Stanford report is agroforestry, which has been adopted in many countries, much more so than the U.S. But the co-benefits associated with putting trees in pastures with livestock, for example, or as windbreaks, as the U.S. did actually in the Great Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Those co-benefits alone in terms of soil stability and biodiversity and avoiding erosion, et cetera, are phenomenal and should be taken into account as well. So part of it is education, and I think helping people appreciate how important a role our major forests play in the world's carbon cycle, and realizing that they can do more. So we've got to stop the deforestation, and then be smarter about how we manage our forests, including for wood. I mean, there's no reason why we can't be much more efficient in terms of and productive in terms of carbon sequestration as we pull timber out of forests and actually store them permanently in long-lived wood products. So this is another thrust that we're exploring here in the U.S. that we hope can be exported globally.
Yes. In my private opinion, and that's purely my opinion, I think that we in the rest of the world, outside the United States, can learn a tremendous amount of what you guys are achieving. Now, when you talk about education, I fully agree. But do you also mean training? Does that include training?
Absolutely. There has to be training. In fact, one of the challenges here in the U.S. in terms of larger adoption of agroforestry, of putting trees more into agricultural lands, is the fact that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the folks who work with the farmers, are separate from the folks at the Department of Agriculture who work on forests. So the folks who work with farmers simply are untrained about the advantages of trees, and how they can actually be synergistic with agriculture. So an important part of our recommendations here in the US is to provide that cross training, to bring the experts, forestry and agricultural experts together so they can talk with the working farmers, with the working ranchers and the working foresters, and everyone can be heading in the same direction.
I think that we at the ICE project, Eyes on Suriname, and Indonesia, and especially Brazil, can play a role there. I haven't heard you talking about the devastation that mining, how do you say it, generates.
Well, certainly
And especially
mining,
especially
yeah.
illegal mining in South America and in Indonesia, you know.
Yes, yes. Well, this is another area. I mean, mining obviously has created enormous environmental damage, historically in the US and certainly ongoing throughout the world. And at the same time, of course, we're recognizing the importance of extracting critical minerals that are needed to help shift our economy to a clean energy economy that needs some of these new materials. The focus has got to be, though, for mining, frankly, like every other major economic sector, it's got to be done in a sustainable way, and in a way that respects nature, and frankly atones for past damage. There needs to be mitigation for mining operations that have destroyed important forests, that are poisoning local populations, etc. This is a very hot topic right now in the U.S. Because of the need for critical minerals, but a recognition that, like everything else in critical supply chains, there has to be a consideration of the climate impacts and the community impacts, and the sustainability impacts more generally, on activities that bring us as world citizens the products that we need, and that are sustainable themselves. They're not sustainable if the entire supply chain isn't sustainable. Yeah. So I think it's a good thing that we're focusing on mining and critical minerals now, and hopefully can ensure that the expansion of mining and certainly new mining operations don't bring with it the devastation that we've seen in the past.
Let me ask you, are you optimistic about the future of your children and grandchildren?
I am optimistic. I'm perhaps it's a fault, but I think it's important that we all be optimistic. I think there are reasons for optimism, though. While on the one hand we are witnessing the devastation that climate change already is bringing to the planet, and it foretells a future that is dark unless we address it aggressively. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the tools now today that we didn't have as recently as 10 years ago to change our global economy away from the fossil fuels that are the primary cause for climate change, and then enlisting nature-based solutions, and also enlisting sort of as I mentioned, the supply chain, and the recognition that everyone's got to be involved, and we have to be sensitive to all communities, and inculcate sustainability principles at all levels. So this is a global problem too, and it means there's got to be global cooperation, and everyone is being reminded now every day about the seriousness of the problem. We have solutions. So that makes me optimistic.
Thank you very much. Where does additional support for incentivizing climate smart forestry practices come from?
Well, in the US, there are 2 or 3 options for incentivizing climate smart practices. And I'm thinking now on the land side, agriculture and forestry. So one is a traditional support structure the US has for agriculture in particular, which are essentially subsidies to encourage farmers and ranchers to do conservation activities. And the $20 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act is going to some of these traditional conservation activities, which often involve planting trees in important sensitive areas. And for the first time, that statute says we want to have the Secretary of Agriculture has to confirm that when those subsidies go out, they are in fact sequestering more carbon or reducing emissions. So we're tying the output of a better climate output to these subsidies. So that's one option. The second option in terms of incentives is being explored aggressively by the Biden administration. The idea is that if we can identify practices like forestry practices or agricultural practices that are climate smart and that produce climate benefits like more carbon sequestration, let's see if we can sell the products that are the result of those good practices, the agricultural commodities or the wood products at a premium. And we think the American consumer and other consumers in developed countries will pay more for products that are produced in a climate smart way. And there's over $3 billion program that is underway now that is exploring that market possibility. That would be an excellent way
What
to.
program is that? Excuse me.
It's called the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program. Take a look at it. Google Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. So that's a second way. A third way, of course, is the potential for carbon markets that would similarly reward the additional sequestration of carbon through good forestry practices, for example. That the voluntary carbon market in the forestry and agricultural sector has not been successful and has been roundly criticized as essentially being fake, largely because of the lack of good data. And our report focuses on the need to have a solid foundation. We know that forests can sequester more carbon. So let's prove it, basically, and let's get databases that prove it. And that can provide the underpinning for voluntary carbon markets, for compliance markets, for money to flow to the folks who are doing those practices and protecting those forests, for example. But the integrity has to be there. It's not yet. And that's why we think investing now here in the US in better data and encouraging things like this new platform called seedtrees.org is a very important piece of the puzzle.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that enhanced MRV tools can be applied to this?
Yes, yeah, that's really what I'm talking about right now. It's measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification, MMRV or MRV in short.
Would it be supervised?
Well, yes. I mean, it's got to be transparent, and the tools, we know what the tools are, but without governmental steerage, if you will, and endorsement of the methodologies and approaches, we're in the Wild West, and so to speak here, and that's a problem with the current situation, which is why our report focused so much on MRV, and I can tell you here in the U.S. there's an enormous amount of attention on this, on a recognition that
I
if we
didn't understand
don't
that. There's a lot of a great amount of what?
attention here in the U.S. on the need to sharpen the measurement, reporting, and verification of carbon sequestration and emissions reductions, because it's the foundation of all of these things. We talked about subsidies, we talked about potential premiums at the marketplace, and we talked about carbon markets. None of them work if there isn't a transparent set of data that shows how these practices are improving carbon sequestration and by how much. So philanthropists here in the U.S., like the Bezos Earth Fund and the High Tide Foundation and many others, are putting a lot of attention on how to improve MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. And with the new satellite technology, with the new AI, going with ground truthing, putting these data sets together and making them generally available to the public, that's how we break through this current phase, which is holding us back here in the US and globally.
And how long do you think that will take before the actual breakthrough is about? How much time do you need, you think?
Well, I think it's going to be iterative. We're already seeing breakthroughs. That seatrees.org mechanism is a breakthrough. But I think the next 2 to 5 years is critical here. And I'm optimistic that that we will make big progress here, in part because of the general recognition by major corporations globally that they have got to be good global citizens and pursue sustainability. And there's pressure on global corporations to show that, in fact, they are pursuing sustainable goals. So how do you do it in this area? You've got to have data. And consumer companies are being asked about the supply chains. You know how much is going on in the EU in this area. So I'm optimistic. And our technology is so much better. We did a report at Stanford on climate smart agriculture that came out earlier this year. And the new technologies that can test the amount of carbon in soils is phenomenal. You can go out to the field and do the test right in the field, as opposed to the current process, which requires you to do a soil sample, send it to a laboratory, get results back, incredibly expensive and cumbersome. And now, in terms of deforestation, for example, with the fidelity of the remote sensing satellites being so strong, you can track what's happening. And then with the ability to get to understand the species of trees and then convert that with the help of machine learning, you can really get very precise information about how much carbon is being stored, and over time, how much additional carbon is being accumulated in well-managed forests. And in my discussions with the presidents and owners of major private forests in the US, they're clamoring for this information so that they can sell their products and at a premium, and get and do more sales and actually have better managed forests at the end of the day. So it's not just a question of preserving the forest, it's also helping to make working forests also contribute here to the climate crisis.
I thank you very, very much, David. I have two more questions. When you talk to
Okay.
the president next, can you ask him to give me a call?
Oh, sure. Yeah, just send me your direct dial.
All right.
I'll send it right along.
All right.
Yes.
Did you read my last question, however? It says, would you or your office be able and willing to support our efforts at Eyes on Brazil, Eyes on Suriname, and especially Eyes on Indonesia, and see if you could guide us with your wisdom and help us in our efforts promoting your world to save this earth?
Well, I appreciate your question, and I'd love to help to the extent I can. I mean, I get a lot of requests. I do know that some folks at Stanford are doing a fair amount in Indonesia, actually.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what they're doing, but one of my colleagues just returned from there. So yeah, just we can stay in touch. But again, I can't overpromise,
In
as I'm
six
sure
to
you can
nine months,
understand.
is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure.
Man, thank you very, very much.
All right, it's my pleasure. Nice to meet you, and good luck with your work.
And you, good luck too. I hope you succeed. I'll pray for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, and back at you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.